the defendants are present, all of their attorneys are present, all of the prosecutors are present, witnesses on the stand, you are still under oath. We left off, Mr. Breen, in the middle of your cross.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thanks, Sergeant.
And I think you were on Perfetti tab 14.
Probably. I now would like to go to the OPR. Orderly submitted by Joseph Walsh. Very good. Sir, what is up on the video right now is a OBR report that purports to have been filed by a Joseph Walsh. I forget the exhibit number.
OBR 1. Walsh, OBR 1.
You're familiar with this form, sir?
Yes, I am.
Now, again, this is the result of using this CLEAR program, filling out some form in the CLEAR system, correct?
Yes.
All right. And again, as you indicated before, you have to do the TRR just to get to this report. What I'd like to ask you, sir, is the number of officers battered, 3. That sounds like, when you a plain reading of it, like 3 officers were battered by the subject, correct?
Yes.
And battered would mean actual physical contact with 3 officers. Correct?
Yes.
Whereas an assault or an aggravated assault does not necessarily mean there's been contact. It means there's a threat, an imminent threat of some harm, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And I think what you told Mr. Fahey, that had we to do this over again, because Officer Gaffney's incident with Mr. McDonald was in a different spot of the shooting, that Mr. Gaffney probably should have put down 1 officer assaulted, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And our reports, that meaning Joseph Walsh's report, should have had 2 instead of 3, correct?
Well, that you know, Your Honor, that implies that there should be any. And he's
Okay.
testified to that.
Your objection is noted but overruled. You can always redirect.
So if there were 2 officers assaulted at the scene of the shooting, this report should have said 2, not 3, correct?
That's correct.
Gotcha. Did I see the bottom of this form? Type of injury to the officer, that none is checked there, right?
Yes.
Okay. So there's no injury, even though the form shows a battery. The battery could in fact be just an assault, correct?
That's correct.
Gotcha. All right. It may be good, sir. The OBR goes through the same supervisor approval as the TRR does, correct?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And you mentioned something else earlier on, and I wanted to go back to it. You mentioned that the officer should take into consideration the totality of the circumstances when they're determining whether or not to use force or whatever action they're going to take, correct?
Yes.
Well, the totality of these circumstances was that an event occurred over in Carlaw and it ended up over at Pulaski, correct?
Yes,
Right. So in your mind, it's two different events, and that's why one OBR should have said 1 and the other should have said 2, correct?
yes, because they happened at separate locations at
Okay.
different times.
Thank you very much, Sergeant.
Thank you.
Your service.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, Mr. McKay.
Your Honor, first I'd like to adopt the cross-examination by Mr. Fahey and Mr. Green
Okay,
on behalf of my client, David March. Sergeant Snelling, you've never been assigned as a detective, correct?
Go ahead.
So, to be clear then, you have no experience in preparing detective reports, right?
No, I don't.
Thank you, sir. Correct me if I'm wrong, you began training police recruits at the police academy in the fall of 2001, is that right?
That's pretty much yes.
Now, please correct me if I misheard you, but when Mr. Fahey was questioning you, did you say a knife is a deadly weapon? Or are you saying a knife is only a deadly weapon if it's used like a deadly weapon?
Yes, a knife can be a deadly weapon depending on how a person uses it.
When you were training police recruits in the academy, isn't it true that you incorporate Illinois law in your training, right?
Yes,
So then you know, Sergeant, that a knife with a blade of 3 inches or more under Illinois law is considered a Category 2 dangerous weapon. Right?
yes,
And in addition to that, the Chicago Police Department, in many of their general orders, incorporates Illinois law, right?
yes,
For example, there is a general order on the use of deadly force by a peace officer in the line of duty. Isn't that right?
yes,
And that general order one of the general orders, Sergeant, is General Order G03-02-03. Does that sound about right?
I'd have to see it.
It's on the way, sir.
Okay.
May I approach?
yes.
Sergeant Sally, and I want to show you a document that you will mark as Defendant March Exhibit 5 for identification. Please take a look at that.
Okay.
Is that the general order I mentioned a second ago, G03-02-03?
Yes,
And is this one of the general orders, Sergeant Stelling, that you would incorporate in the training of young police recruits at the police academy?
yes,
And does this general order appear to be the general order that was given to police recruits in and around, well, since you started in the fall of 2001 up to February of 2015?
yes. And this would have been taught by our law division.
Right? But you would also teach use of force.
Yes.
In your recruits, would you not?
Yes.
And so you would use this
This
in
is-
your training, would you not?
Yes.
So, Sergeant Snelling, please tell me if this is how that general order reads, sir. A general, it's right there. A sworn member is justified in using force likely to cause death or great bodily harm only when he or she reasonably believes that such force is necessary, one, to prevent death or great bodily harm to the sworn member or to another person, or, and I place emphasis on the or two, to prevent an arrest from being defeated by resistance or escape, and the sworn member reasonably believes that the person to be arrested, A, has committed or has attempted to commit a forcible felony, which involves the infliction, threatened infliction, or threatened use of physical force likely to cause death or great bodily harm. Or, I emphasize that, or, B, is attempting to escape by use of a deadly weapon, or, again an emphasis on the or, the last option, otherwise indicates that he or she will endanger human life or inflict great bodily harm unless arrested without delay. Sergeant, did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did.
Thank you, sir. So, you told us earlier that the gentleman by the name of Rudy Barillas, who was attacked by Mr. McDonald with this knife, at that moment, McDonald was an assailant, correct?
Yes.
And indeed, you know now, sir, that Mr. Barillas was the civilian, the citizen who called 911, asking for help, right?
Yes, I now know that.
And this gentleman, Officer Gaffney, and his partner, Officer McElligott, were the two uniformed police officers that responded to that citizen's call for help, right?
Yes.
And you told us earlier, did you not, that when Officer Gaffney, trying to use his police SUV, tried to block Mr. McDonald, and McDonald took that knife and punctured the tire of that SUV, and also used that knife against the windshield of that SUV, at that moment, McDonald was an assailant as well.
Well, what I testified to in furtherance, that the motion by McDonald was toward the officer, walking toward the officer where the officer was in the vehicle, and leading the officer to reasonably believe that he was under threat also. So yes.
Thank you, sir. So if I had this correct, Rudy Barillas is a victim of at least an aggravated assault, and Tom Gaffney is a victim of at least an aggravated assault, correct?
Based on that information,
Yes, sir. And what you're saying today, though, is when McDonald gets to Pulaski, at that moment, he's merely an active resistor.
Based on the actions that I see in the video at that very moment, yes.
Thank you. And we'll agree, will we not, Sergeant, that your opinion that McDonald is an active resistor is based solely on the video?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I understand, as you've already stated, the video has limitations. But will you agree with me, Sergeant, that even if that opinion that McDonald is merely an active resistor on Pulaski, based solely on this limited video, would you still agree with me, though, that Officers Walsh and Van Dyke, because they are human beings, they have at that moment the human conditions of excitement, fear, adrenaline? Would you agree with me, sir?
Oh, yeah, the officer goes through these emotions all the time, especially in a high-risk situation.
Thank you. In a high-risk situation like this, as you told us earlier, happened so quickly, didn't it?
Yes.
An officer, a human being in a police uniform has to make a very quick decision, correct?
And depending on the circumstances, yes.
And he does not have the luxury, or she does not have the luxury, of watching a video, stopping it, rewinding it, and reassessing what decision to make. At the moment, he's making it, right? On the street.
Yeah, the officers don't have the advantage of 20/20 hindsight.
Thanks. But let's just talk about the video for a brief moment here. Would you agree with me that while McDonald is walking southbound on Pulaski, you see Officers Walsh and Van Dyke approaching on an angle, right?
Yes.
Okay. And while Van Dyke and Officer Walsh are approaching McDonald on an angle, McDonald is actually still walking southbound, right?
Yes.
McDonald did not stop as Walsh and Van Dyke are approaching, correct?
That's correct, yes.
So, as Walsh and Van Dyke are approaching on an angle, and as McDonald is walking southbound on Pulaski, the distance between McDonald and Officers Walsh and Van Dyke, from the moment those two officers exited their squad car until the moment the shooting started, the distance had decreased. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. And to put it in simpler terms, those two officers and that either assailant or active resistor, the distance was getting closer.
I would say yes.
Thank you, Sergeant. Regarding that general order I just showed you a little while ago, are you familiar with the term forcible felony?
Yes.
And Illinois law, as you know from this general order that is almost verbatim with Illinois law, defines what a forcible felony is, correct?
That's correct.
And one of the forcible felonies is the felony of burglary, correct?
That's correct.
So if I'm breaking into trucks, stealing radios, I'm committing burglary to an auto. Fair to say?
Yes.
And that definition of forcible felony includes not just that felony, but also other violent felonies. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And there's a catchphrase in that Illinois law that includes any other felony which involves the use or threat of physical use or violence against an individual, right?
Yes.
Like aggravated assault to a police officer, right?
Yes.
Like attempt murder of a citizen who then called 911. Or strike it. An attempt murder of a citizen who had just called 911. Right?
Yes.
Finally, Sergeant, you told us earlier that in light of the video, in light of what you know, Officer Thomas Gaffney did everything appropriately that night when he confronted McDonald, right?
Again, from the information that I received from Officer Gaffney, he utilized time, called for additional resources, distance. He handled the job the way any great police officer would have handled.
Thank you. One of the reasons, sir, is because McDonald used force at Officer Gaffney when he was approaching Officer Gaffney with that knife and stabbed not only the tire of that SUV, but also the windshield that separated McDonald from Officer Gaffney. Isn't that true?
Oh, I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
One of the reasons you believe Officer Gaffney acted appropriately that night is because McDonald used force at or near, directed at Officer Gaffney. True?
Based on the information, puncturing the tire, striking the windshield, could have placed the officer in reasonable belief that if he exited the vehicle, that this would escalate to a physical attack.
Sergeant, you've been a Chicago police officer for what, 27 years?
Close to.
And then you know that a private citizen does not have the authority to resist arrest. Isn't that true?
That's true.
And yet police officers are confronted every day with individuals who will not comply with police orders to stop, right?
Yes, oftentimes.
They are confronted with individuals who will not comply with police orders to drop the weapon, right?
Yes.
And then you are familiar, Sergeant Snelling, with the Illinois law on a private person's use of force in resisting arrest, which reads, a person is not authorized to use force to resist an arrest, which he knows is being made either by a peace officer or even a private citizen summoned and directed by a peace officer to make arrest, even if he believes that the arrest is unlawful and the arrest, in fact, is unlawful. Isn't that the Illinois law on a citizen has no right to resist arrest?
That's true.
Gentlemen.
Certainly, take your time.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions. Sergeant, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Safer, any redirect?
Yes, thank you.
Sergeant Snelling, let's start right around where Mr. McKay left off. He talked to you about the use of force to prevent a forcible felon from escaping. Do you recall that?
Yes.
If someone were used deadly force to stop a forcible felon from escaping, where would they indicate that?
It would be indicated in the case report. It would be indicated in the tactical response report.
And on the tactical response report, would they put down fled?
Yes.
You were asked whether the distance between Laquan McDonald and the officers on the scene decreased. Do you recall those questions?
Yes.
It decreased in part because officers Walsh and Van Dyke advanced towards Laquan McDonald, correct?
In part, yes.
When you testified that Laquan McDonald was walking south, in fact, once officers Van Dyke and Officer Walsh arrived on the scene, he started walking southwest. Isn't that correct?
He appeared to be walking south and on an angle to his right.
Away from the officers.
It appears that way in the video. Yes.
Now, you were asked that officers make their decisions. They have to make decisions on the street. And sometimes those are split-second decisions, right?
Yes.
I think every defense counsel asked you that, and that is true. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
When an officer is completing a report, are those split-second decisions?
Completing a report?
Yes.
No, there's time to complete a report.
A report is completed in hindsight, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And do you know that in this case, officers Van Dyke and Officer Walsh watched the videos before completing their reports?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
At any rate, those reports are not the completion of the reports. They are not done when an officer is flushed with adrenaline, excitement, etc. Correct? Those are back at the station.
Yeah, those absolutely should not be done under those circumstances.
Okay. Now, you were asked by Mr. Fahey about a hypothetical of the Laquan McDonald turning towards the officer and stabbing at the officer and hitting the windshield. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And it was that hypothetical that you were answering the questions about, right? That Laquan McDonald looked at Officer Gaffney and stabbed at Officer Gaffney. Is that right?
I believe he made more of a motion, not necessarily the stabbing, but more of a motion with the knife raised. Yes.
Now, you were asked by at least a couple of defense attorneys about Rudy Bareilles and that there was a conflict with Mr. Bareilles where Mr. McDonald used the knife. Do you recall those questions?
Yes.
Could I ask you to turn in your notebook to tab 7, which has been admitted into evidence as People Exhibit Radio Transcript 1. Do you see that?
Yes.
You have reviewed that transcript, have you not?
Yes, I have.
The dispatcher says it's a man holding citizen, 4100 Kildare by the United Rental, a male who he caught breaking into trucks and stealing radios. He's holding him. Do you see that?
Yes.
That's the only thing that the dispatcher says about the incident with Mr. Bareilles, right?
Yes, based on this transmission, yes.
Nobody listening to this transmission knows anything about what Mr. Bareilles said happened between him and Mr. McDonald, right?
Yep, it's just based on this transmission. And yeah, I have no reason to believe that they would have the information.
Okay. You were asked some questions about sharing of information on these tactical response reports. Is that right?
Yes.
When in the section reasons for use of force, should that be based on shared information?
Reasons for use of force?
Yes.
That information should be based on the officers on scene and the officers involved in the actual use of force.
The officer who's completing the form,
yes,
correct?
As long as the officer is able to complete the form and the supervisor doesn't have to complete it for him, the officer should be recording and documenting based on his or her knowledge.
Not what, again, we'll assume for all of these purposes that the officer is alive, who is completing the report is alive and well. Okay?
Okay.
The officer does not fill that portion of the report out based on collective information, correct?
Well, the information would be based on the officer's knowledge, and again, if the officers have the opportunity to review a video, if there's one that exists, they can actually utilize that video to do so.
Yes, but it is that officer, not the collective
Objection.
officer.
Ask and answer.
Yes,
A total room.
Is that correct, sir?
yes, it is.
Now, you were asked whether if Miss Officer Walsh reasonably, or if Officer Walsh believed that the assailant used deadly force, whether it would have been appropriate for him to check the box, uses deadly force. Do you recall those questions?
Yes,
You weren't testifying as to whether, or you've already testified that in your view, based on the video, he should not have checked that box, correct?
based on the video, yes.
Okay. So you were, again, answering a hypothetical at that point.
Yes,
Okay. Now, you were asked, could Defendant Walsh have presented his reasons for doing what he did in 2 hours of grand jury testimony? Do you recall that question?
yes.
On the night or the morning after the shooting, where should Defendant Walsh recorded his reasons for his actions?
Again, case report and the tactical response report.
Not in a grand jury, correct?
Well, that's later.
Okay. You were asked by Mr. Fahey whether, or questions about Officer Gaffney requesting additional cars and calling for a taser. Do you recall those questions?
Yes.
That isn't exactly accurate, sir, is it? Could you turn to page 3? Again, we're on tab 7, and it's radio transcript 1. What page? Page 3. Or if we go back to page 2, I mean, there's a lot of silence in here, but it's 8:15 Robert, says 15 Robert, and then the speaker, who I think we're all agreed is Defendant Gaffney, says, we're at 40th and Keeler. This guy's kind of walking away from us. He's got a knife in his hand. The dispatcher says, all right, anyone have a taser to help out 40 and Keeler for 8:15 Robert? Looking for a taser, armed offender. Is that what the transcript reads?
Yes, it does.
It wasn't Defendant Gaffney who asked for a taser or additional cars. It was the dispatcher, correct?
That appears that way here, yes.
Sergeant, you were asked by Mr. McKay if every day police officers are faced with dangerous situations, correct?
Yes.
And that they're confronted every day by people, you said, who don't put down knives when asked, correct?
Yes.
How often do police officers shoot those people to death?
Well, not very often.
Thank you, sir. If I can have a moment, Your Honor.
Certainly take your time.
Nothing further.
Okay. Any recross, Mr. Fahey?
Judge, I have no further questions.
Mr. Green?
Yes, Judge, may I go from here? Just a couple questions.
Yes.
So part of the training as to how to write reports and Do police officers, are they trained to gather the information, speak to their partners, and write reports together?
That's not necessarily a part of the training academy, but officers do need to come together at some point and share information when it comes to completing a report with accuracy.
All right, thanks, sir. Oh, I have no question, further questions.
I'm just trying to catch up on my writing. I'm taking my notes. All right, Mr. McKay, any
Oh.
recross?
I will adopt Mr. Green's recross, and I have no.
Anything further state? Any redirect?
Can I, just one moment?
Sure.
And just for the record, so it's clear, I'm also adopting Mr. Green's
It's clear now.
recross. Thank you.
I have nothing further, Your Honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're excused. You may step down.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take recess. It's 2:05, so we're in recess until 3:05.